Today we're going to be talking about the knit stitch. And there are a few ways to make the knit stitch. The two most popular are Continental and English. And I like to call them by not their regional names, but what they actually describe, the motion they describe. So the English method is the first one I'll show you, and it's the most popular method in America. Both stitches are going to start the same way. So you're sticking the right hand needle. Oh, first I should show you. You should figure out a way to tension your yarn. Some people will kind of pick up the yarn and drop it between each knit stitch, but that's not going to be a great way to keep proper even tension while you're knitting. So try to develop a method that works for you and feels comfortable, that lets the yarn feed through your hand. What I like to do is wrap it around my pinky once and then over my index finger, and then I have it in my hand and see it's kind of tensioned around my pinky, and you can figure out what works best for you. The same is not going to be, it's not going to be the same for everyone. You might weave it in and out of a couple fingers, or wrap it around one finger twice, or just find something that feels comfortable. So I wrap it around my pinky, have it over my index, and then you're sticking your right hand needle. I like to tell new knitting students that you're just going to remember this direction. So you're going from the left to the right in a diagonal. So you're sticking your needle in from the left, and you're going back towards the back of the knitting through the stitch. You're wrapping or throwing. This is called throwing. This is the English method. And then you're just going to reverse it and go back, right back from where you came. So right back through, and then get that stitch off the needle, and that's your new stitch. So experienced knitters, you know all of this. One tip that I like to remind people of, something I forget to do, is when you're making a stitch, try not to work up on the tips of the needles. It's really tempting to do that because when you get up to the tip of the needle, there's a little more space to get your other needle in there. If you're a tight knitter, that tends to be the tendency to work really close up to the tips, but that's sort of what's making the tight stitches. So you need to be able to wrap the loop of yarn all the way around the base of the needle here, the widest part. That's what's determining the size of your next new loop and ultimately the gauge of your knitting. So see what I mean? Get the needle all the way in there, wrap it around that part, not the tip, and pull it through and get it off. Some people like to do, newer knitters might put their finger on the end of the needle like that to keep the loop from popping off. That's a common problem. They'll be pulling it through and they'll lose the loop, it'll fall off, and they'll get really anxious. So a fingertip can help with that. Okay, I finished a couple rows in English style, or throwing, and I want to show you Continental now. And there are similarities, at least the way I knit. You can see the tensioning is going to be the same sort of thing. So when I switch to my left hand for Continental or picking, I wrap it around my pinky and then my index finger, and the needle is going into the stitch the same exact way. So remember, from left to right and towards the back. So go into the base of the stitch and go from left to right, and then the yarn is going to be parallel to the needle. I try not to have my finger up quite so high. Parallel to the needle, and you're just going to go over the yarn in a clockwise direction. So you're picking a loop and pulling it through. And same thing, as I said before, beginners might want to keep the yarn on the needle with their fingertip just like that, so it doesn't pop off. I actually still do that. It's a bit of a crutch. I'm trying to stop. I'm sure it slows me down. So people like this method for its speed because it's very efficient. And I actually like to do kind of a combination of picking and throwing. So I'm picking a stitch, and I also like to help it by throwing it over. So it's sort of a hybrid method. And it's really fast. So we just saw Continental, and you saw how fast it can crank along. English style for me can be just as fast. I sort of do a throwing, try to be as efficient as I can be about keeping the yarn in the same place. The tensioning really is key here. I think that's where a lot of speed comes from. It's just being able to have that yarn in the exact right place so you can just throw it over the next stitch. And I feed it along with my fingers, and it's pretty fast. Some knitters are going to feel a lot more comfortable with one method. I recommend learning both. You can switch between them if you're having sort of pain on one side, or one way of knitting is causing you pain. Or if you were doing color work, you can work with both hands, equally, with equal amounts of comfort, and it's really fast and efficient that way too. A good way to learn is to just take on a whole project, maybe an in-the-round sweater or something that has a lot of knit stitches, and just focus on only using the other method that's not your first most comfortable method. That's how I learned to do continental and have it really stick in kind of a muscle memory way. Now they both feel equally automatic. I want to talk about the orientation of the stitch on the needle. So if you look at stockinette, if you've never really examined your stockinette before, you see that each stockinette stitch is a little V, and the bottom there is nice and neat. It doesn't overlap, it just forms a nice little V that they touch, but they don't overlap. If you look at the stitches on the needle, it looks like they're straight, but they're actually a little askew. So you can see the angle, all the stitches are a little bit this way. That's because the yarn is going, on this side it's going to the next stitch, and in the back it's coming from the previous stitch. And actually that's a really important point. When you're making a knit stitch, try not to, let's see, I need to unknit a little bit here. Sometimes newer knitters, or if you're a tight knitter, it might be because you're doing something like this. You make the stitch and then you tug a little bit to neaten it up and get it nice and snug on the needle. Actually, what happens when you're knitting, you knit a stitch, and that actually, the motion of making a new stitch pulls the previous stitch and tightens that just enough, just what you need. And that's gonna, if you tug it, you're actually tightening it a second time. So that's gonna lead to really tight knitting that you have to squinch along the needles, and it's gonna squeak and be really hard to knit and not enjoyable. So try not to tug the knitting after you've made a stitch, because it's already being tensioned by making the next stitch. So it's really efficient and awesome that way. So while you're knitting, you might come across a stitch. Sometimes this happens if you have to take it off the needle and then put it back on. And if you're not aware, you might come across a stitch like this. See that right there? You can see that it's not on the needle, it's not oriented the right way. Instead of facing in this sort of direction like all the other stitches, you can see that it's the other way. So it's actually at this angle. To correct that without fiddling too much, you can just knit that into the back loop, and that corrects it and makes it nice and straight again, and the yarn on the needle is in its correct direction. Sometimes you want to do this with a normal stitch to cross it on purpose. So you just knit it through the back loop, and you can see that at the bottom now they're kind of twisted, so it's a cross stockinette stitch or a twisted stitch. This makes a really nice tight ribbing. Oops. See that right there? It creates a bit of texture, and it's a nice decorative effect. So you're just knitting to the back loop. And again, I'm gonna reorient the stitch so it's not on there properly, so you can see that correction again. Oops, so it's got on the needle, it's not correct, something looks wrong. You can check the top to see where the angle is going. Just knit that to the back loop to get it right back where it needs to be. So the last thing I want to point out about the knit stitch is that sometimes people like to say that there's only 2 stitches in knitting. So knitting and purling, once you've mastered those, that's really the only tools that you need to go on and master all of knitting. But there's actually only 1 stitch, because when you make the knit stitch, you're actually making a purl stitch. So you see the back of every knit stitch is a purl. If you look at the back of it, there's a purl bump. So when you go backwards, I'm going to just do a little short row here. To get stockinette, you just have to work a knit stitch in reverse and purl, and if you turn that over, you're making knit stitches. So in essence, there's only 1 stitch. You're just working it in slightly different ways. You're either working it with the wrong side facing you, or its right side facing you. The truly clever people can knit backwards. I haven't quite mastered that yet, but I had a friend who did that, who got garter stitch. I had taught him the knit stitch, and he thought that, oh, my knitting looks wrong, it's all bumpy, it doesn't look like yours. Of course, he wasn't getting stockinette stitch. So he figured out how to knit backwards. He thought turning the needles must be wrong, the wrong thing to do, so yep, I can't quite figure out how to do it, or I'd show you. Maybe next time.